Clara hadn't planned to fall apart, not there, not then, not in front of the one man who carried silence like armor and strength like a second skin. She had come to the ranch porch only for air, for space, for a moment where she didn't have to pretend to be fine. But grief never cared about timing, and as the sun sank behind the wide western horizon, painting everything gold and rose, something inside her finally cracked. She felt it the way a tired beam gives beneath. Too much weight, quiet at first, then total. Her breath shuddered, her vision blurred, and before she could stop herself, the truth slipped out in a whisper so soft it nearly vanished into the wind. It hurts too much. She didn't mean the small aches of the dash. She meant the deep wounds she carried like bruises across her heart. The loneliness she hid behind forced smiles. The losses she swallowed so she wouldn't trouble anyone. The betrayals that bruised her trust until she barely recognized herself. And Jackson Tal, steady, rough-handed. Jackson didn't look startled or uncomfortable. He didn't turn away or pretend he hadn't heard. Instead, he approached her slowly, the way a man approaches a frightened creature. He wants to help but doesn't want to scare. The porch boards creaked under his boots, but his voice was soft, almost careful, as if he understood the brittleness of the moment. When he reached her side, he didn't touch her. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the quiet steadiness of him. "Then let me be your strength," he murmured, the words low and warm, like a blanket pulled over shaking shoulders. And something in those 6 simple words shook her more than her own confession. Because he wasn't offering to fix everything, or to erase her pain, or to pretend she wasn't hurting. He was offering himself, his presence, his steadiness, for as long as she needed it. A breath trembled in her chest, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was drowning alone. The weight she carried didn't disappear, but it shifted just enough that she could stand without collapsing. And in that fragile twilight moment, Clara realized that maybe strength wasn't always something you had to find within yourself. Sometimes, it was something someone else could lend you, gently, patiently, without asking anything in return. Clara tried to speak, but the words came out tangled and trembling, as though they'd been trapped inside her for far too long, and no longer knew how to form themselves properly. She kept her eyes on the fading horizon, unable to meet Jackson's steady gaze, afraid that if she saw compassion there, she might break even more. When she finally forced the words out, they came in fragments, pieces of a life that had been shaken apart. She told him about losing her mother, how the grief had hollowed out her chest until she felt like a room echoing with absence. She described the fiancé he once promised the world but walked away when she needed him most, calling her too heavy, too emotionally, too much trouble. Words that still scraped her heart raw whenever she remembered them. Shame clung to her voice as she confessed how she depacked everything into a single bag and fled west, hoping the wide-open sky might be big enough to swallow her pain. She braced herself for judgment, for dismissal, for the quiet withdrawal she'd learned to expect whenever she revealed too much. But Jackson didn't recoil. He simply leaned against the porch railing beside her, folding his arms as though settling in to listen for as long as she needed. His silence wasn't cold. It was the kind that made space. When she faltered, when her breath hitched, he nodded gently, urging her to continue without a single spoken push. And when she finally ran out of words, when all that remained was the shaking in her hands and the ache in her chest, he spoke in a tone soft enough to steady her heartbeat. "You've carried too much alone, Clara. Nobody should have to." There was no pity in his voice, only understanding, the kind born from someone who knew what it meant to hurt quietly. She felt something shift inside her, as though his calm presence wrapped around the raw edges of her pain. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel foolish or weak for hurting. She felt human. And as the last of the twilight faded, Clara realized that being seen, truly seen, didn't have to be terrifying. It could be the first moment of healing. You said. The next morning, Clara woke with eyes still puffy from the night before, expecting the awkwardness that usually followed moments of vulnerability, distance, forced politeness, that subtle shift people made when they realized she was carrying more pain than they had bargained for. But when she stepped outside, blinking against the early sun, she found something entirely different waiting for her. Jackson was already in the yard, moving with quiet purpose as he tightened the saddle on his horse. There was no stiffness in his posture, no careful avoidance of her gaze. Instead, he gave her a small nod, The kind that said, "Morning, and you're safe," and nothing's changed. Beside the porch steps, a steaming mug of coffee sat waiting for her, its warmth curling into the cool air. She realized instantly that he had made it for her not out of obligation but out of awareness, the kind that came from noticing what others missed. Later, when she returned to her cabin, she saw that the front hinge crooked for weeks, always catching and jarring her nerves, had been fixed. Smooth, sturdy. She hadn't asked. She hadn't even mentioned it. Jackson had simply seen that something in her life was a little broken and decided to mend it, quietly, without taking any credit. Watching him from behind the thin curtain of her window, Clara felt a tightening in her throat, not the painful kind from yesterday, but the unfamiliar swelling of gratitude. He wasn't trying to solve her grief or erase her memories. He wasn't offering grand gestures or empty promises. Instead, he was lifting the small weights she'd grown so accustomed to carrying that she'd forgotten life could be lighter, even for a moment. And as she stood there, fingers wrapped around the warm mug, she realized what made his kindness so powerful. It was steady, unrushed, expecting nothing in return. Jackson helped the way a man helps, when he genuinely wants to ease someone's burden, not because he thinks she is fragile, but because he sees her fighting and wants her to have a little more strength left for the battles that really mattered. For the first time in months, Clara felt a sliver of calm slip into the cracks of her heart, as though someone had finally stepped close enough to catch the pieces before they fell again. The storm arrived suddenly, rolling over the mountains like a dark, living thing, and by afternoon the sky had cracked open with a violence that made Clara's skin crawl. Thunder slammed against the earth, shaking the windows of the cabin, and the sound hit her with the force of memory, sharp, merciless, familiar in the worst way. It dragged her back to the night her mother slipped away, to the hospital hallway, where rain hammered the roof while she sat helpless and numb, waiting for news that broke her forever. Her breathing quickened, shallow and panicked, and before she knew what she was doing, she pushed out the door and into the storm, desperate to outrun the suffocating echo inside her chest. Rain soaked her instantly, clinging to her clothes, turning the ground to mud beneath her feet. She didn't care. She ran blindly toward the open field, driven by an ache she couldn't name, until her legs buckled and the trembling finally overtook her. She sank to her knees, hands buried in the cold earth, her sobs lost in the roar of the storm. She didn't hear the cabin door slam behind her. She didn't see Jackson sprinting after her until his shadow fell across her trembling form. He didn't shout, he didn't scold. He simply dropped to his knees beside her, rain pouring down his face, soaking his coat, his breaths coming hard from the run. Then, without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her strong, steady, grounding, and pulled her against him as though protecting her from a world that had already taken too much. "Clara," he murmured into her wet hair, his voice breaking with a softness that steadied her, "don't run alone." And there, in the downpour, with the storm raging like a physical echo of her own pain, she clung to him with a desperation that frightened her. But Jackson only held her tighter, his warmth a fragile sanctuary against the cold fury around them. For the first time in years, she didn't try to hide her breaking. She let it spill out, wild and messy, into the arms of a man who didn't flinch from her darkness. In that moment, beneath the storm's roar, she realized she wasn't fighting the memories alone anymore. Someone else was finally standing in the rain with her. "You said," when the storm finally softened into a weary drizzle. Jackson lifted Clara gently and carried her back inside, his coat dripping, his boots leaving muddy prints across the floor. He set her by the fire, wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders, and knelt in front of her as though anchoring her back to herself. Clara kept apologizing, sorry for running, sorry for breaking down, sorry for being too much. But Jackson shook his head with a firmness softened by compassion. He sat beside her, the fire casting gold across his tired face. And after a long, quiet moment, he spoke words she never expected to hear from a man who always seemed carved from stone. He told her about his brother, how they'd grown up inseparable, how Jackson had always been the strong one, the steady one, the one everyone leaned on, and how, one winter, a mistake made on the trail cost his brother his life. Jackson's voice cracked as he confessed how he had replayed that day 1,000 times, how guilt gnawed at him even years later, how he woke some nights with the taste of frost and failure in his throat. Clara stared at him, stunned not because he was hurting, but because he trusted her enough to show it. The man she had leaned on, the man who had held her in the storm, was not unbreakable. He was a wounded soul who had learned to hide his fractures beneath quiet strength. People think being strong means never hurting, he murmured, eyes fixed on the flames. But real strength is getting up again when the hurt sits heavy on your chest. It's choosing to keep going even when it feels impossible. His words settled over her like a warm weight, grounding and gentle. He wasn't saying she should be stronger. He was telling her she already was, that surviving her grief, even imperfectly, took more courage than she realized. Clara felt something shift inside her, a slow thawing around the part of her heart that believed she was a burden. Jackson wasn't helping her out of pity. He was walking beside her because he understood pain intimately, deeply, and somehow, knowing he carried his own ghosts, made her feel less alone with hers. In the quiet after his confession, she reached for his hand, not out of despair this time, but solidarity, and he let her hold it, strong and steady, like he had been waiting for her to do so all along. In the days that followed, something unspoken but profound shifted between them. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just a slow, steady weaving of two wounded lives that had learned the hard way how to stand alone for too long. Clara woke each morning, expecting the old fear to return, the instinct to pull away before she became too dependent. But it never came. Instead, she found comfort in the gentle routines that formed naturally between them. Jackson handing her a second cup of coffee without asking how she slept. Clara, wordlessly joining him in the barn to brush down the horses, their quiet companionship filling spaces where loneliness used to live. Jackson began teaching her small things: how to adjust a stirrup without pinching her fingers, how to guide a skittish colt with patience rather than for sand. Clara discovered that learning didn't make her feel foolish anymore, not with him. Some days, she laughed for the first time in months, surprised by the sound that felt both foreign and familiar. Other days, the memories crept back, heavy and suffocating, and she would freeze midway through a chore as grief tightened its grip again. But Jackson never pushed her to be cheerful, never told her to be strong. He simply stepped beside her, close enough that she felt his presence before she saw him, and together they would breathe through the moment until the weight loosened. At night, when the sky turned silver with moonlight, they often sat on the porch without speaking, her shoulder occasionally brushing his arm, their silence becoming a soft place where neither had to pretend. Clara realized she was learning to lean not in desperation, but in trust, in the quiet belief that she no longer had to carry everything alone. And Jackson, who had built walls around his own heart long before she arrived, found himself letting her in with the tenderness he hadn't thought he still possessed. The ranch, once a place of retreat for him, became a place of healing for them both. Slowly, gently, they were teaching each other what it meant to share the burden of pain and the fragile hope that followed. And though neither said it aloud yet, they both felt it. This connection was becoming something neither of them had expected, but both desperately needed. Clara stood by the creek that evening. The sky stretched out above her in soft watercolor shades of peach and lavender, the kind of quiet beauty she once felt too broken to notice. The water moved gently, reflecting the flickering light like a trembling mirror of her own fragile heart. She had come there to think, to breathe, to face the ache that still lived inside her, but something was different this time. Her hands weren't shaking, her breath wasn't trapped in her chest. The grief was still there, yes, but it no longer swallowed her whole. It sat beside her like a heavy guest she had finally grown strong enough to acknowledge. When she heard Jackson's footsteps behind her, slow, steady, never intrusive, she didn't stiffen or hide her face. Instead, she turned slightly, as if she had been waiting for him. He approached quietly, his hat in one hand, his eyes searching her expression with the same gentle care he had shown from the beginning. "It still hurts," she admitted, her voice calm, almost accepting, carrying neither apology nor shame. And for a moment, the confession hung between them like a delicate thread. Jackson stepped beside her, close enough that his warmth brushed her shoulder. He didn't offer solutions or pretend that hurt simply disappeared. He just looked at her with a depth that made her feel seen all the way through. "Then I'll stay," he said, his tone steady, unwavering, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. "As long as it takes." The words didn't feel like rescue, they felt like partnership, like a promise built on understanding rather than obligation. Clara felt her chest swell, not with overwhelming emotion this time, but with something gentler, steadier, hope. She reached for his hands slowly, as though offering a piece of herself she had long guarded. And when his fingers closed around hers, warm and firm, something inside her loosened, healed, softened. She realized she wasn't clinging to him for survival anymore. She was choosing him, choosing them, choosing a future where she didn't walk alone through the echoes of her pain. Standing beside the quiet creek, with Jackson's hand wrapped securely around hers, Clara felt the first true flicker of strength blooming from her own heart. Not borrowed, but shared. And for the first time, the horizon ahead didn't look frightening, it looked possible. Days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself standing once again on the same ranch porch where she had first broken. But this time the moment felt different, lighter, steadier, touched by a quiet strength she never would have believed herself capable of feeling again. The wind brushed softly through her hair, warm instead of biting, carrying with it the scent of hay, pine, and the promise of something new. She wrapped her arms around herself, not to hold in the pieces as she once had, but simply because she was thinking, reflecting, breathing. Jackson approached from behind, his footsteps familiar and comforting, and when he slipped an arm carefully around her waist, she didn't tense or shy away. Instead, she leaned back into him naturally, as though her body had already learned the shape of safety. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured against her temple, his breath warm, his voice steady with conviction. His words didn't spark tears or disbelief this time. Instead, they settled deep inside her like truth she had already begun to accept. Clara smiled, a soft, real smile that reached her eyes and rested her hand on his, gently squeezing. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice touched with gratitude and quiet confidence. "But you helped me remember." It wasn't dependence, it was recognition. Jackson hadn't saved her. He had stood beside her as she saved herself, step by trembling step, until she could breathe, without feeling the world collapse in her chest. She looked out over the ranch, the horses grazing peacefully, the golden grass swaying, the sky stretching endlessly above them, and realized she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Belonging. Healing hadn't come in a sudden rush. It had come in small moments, in shared silences, in steady hands, in kindness that expected nothing. With Jackson's arms around her, and her own heart beating strong and quiet, Clara stepped forward, not into someone else's life, but into her own. The pain she carried hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined her. What defined her now was resilience, hope, and the man who had walked through every storm at her side. And as the sun dipped low and the world softened around them, Clara knew with certainty this wasn't an ending. It was the first chapter of her life she finally felt brave enough to live. "You said